There is a room inside time where the air never stirs, where breath echoes like prayer, and the dust on the stone floor remembers every footstep that tried to flee. It is not a place, but a feeling, a veil between then and now. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it whisper. Before love had a name, it had a shadow. It slipped between cloisters and chambers, beneath candlelight and cloaks. Not loud, but lingering. It lived in glances not held too long, in letters burned before dawn, in sighs woven into rosary prayers. This is not the love we think we know. It was never pink or perfumed. It was not celebrated in songs, not then. No. It was watched, measured, judged, because in the Middle Ages, love was dangerous. To love, truly love, was to trespass against the world God was said to have ordered. To want was to wound something sacred. To feel too deeply was to fall, and yet they did. Even when it cost them names, homes, lives. Even when it meant silence. Even when it meant fire, they still loved. But they loved like alchemists, turning desire into devotion, pain into poetry, absence into relics and cathedral shadows. Lovers touched hands only in passing, and called it a miracle. In castle towers, women sang to the moon, not for company, but for memory. Because memory was safer than longing, and somewhere, always, a scribe, writing down what could not be spoken. A phrase on parchment, a scratched symbol hidden in a psalm. Secret testaments, left behind not to be read, but to be felt. They believed love was a temptation. But some began to wonder, what if it was a visitation? A divine fever. A sacred ruin. A truth so bright it had to be hidden in shadow. Was love a rebellion? Or a kind of worship? The veil thickened to desire, became prayer. Touch became ritual. To wait for a lover became its own liturgy, and as chants filled the churches, other voices whispered through stone. Not louder, but deeper. Like old echoes returning home, they didn't speak of love the way we do. But they felt it in ways we've forgotten, not just in hearts, but in bones. In confessions. In locked doors. In the stillness after the final bell tolls. And so we ask the first quiet question. Not to answer it, but to let it open something. What is the cost of desire? When heaven is watching, what are we willing to sacrifice? For something that lives only in the space between sin and salvation. The veil does not lift yet. But it stirs. Just slightly, and something ancient begins to breathe. Not history. Not story. But memory, yours, perhaps. Or someone you once were, somewhere, far away, and yet terribly near. The first candle flickers. And the dream begins. In the beginning, there was no shame. Only skin under sun. Warmth between ribs. The rhythm of breath shared by two who did not yet know they were naked. But time passed, and Eden fell, not with thunder, but with a whisper, cover yourself. By the time the cathedrals rose, the body was no longer a temple, it was a battleground. The Middle Ages did not fear death. It feared desire. To want was to sin. To touch was to transgress. To long, truly long, was to step outside the sanctuary of God and into a darker chapel. One made of mirrors, heat, and trembling hands. The church had its scriptures, but it also had its chains. Penance became performance. Shame became doctrine. And the flesh, the tender, aching, restless flesh, was taught to bow that a kiss could damn. A dream could stain. And a woman's smile? That could be the serpent itself, but still, beneath the stone and the sermons, something refused to die. Moved like smoke through monastery halls. It pulsed behind closed confessionals. It lived in the margins of manuscripts, where monks sketched lovers in the curls of vines. It lived in the blush of the bride and the sweat of the soldier. It lived in silence. But it lived, because even when the church turned the body into guilt, the soul still remembered its hunger. They wrote manuals, secret ones, on how to repent for craving a touch, how to cleanse the sin of a sigh. They called it lust. They called it weakness. They called it everything, except holy, but some knew better. There were women who wept in ecstasy, calling it divine. Mystics who said God entered them, not through thought, but through tremble. There were texts whispered under moonlight, rituals passed hand to hand, spells not to summon demons, but to call forth forgotten sweetness, a moment of union that could not be confessed. The church feared heresy. But what if love was the first one? What if it was not the serpent, but the fruit itself, ripe, golden, glowing, that was too powerful to be allowed, and so they built walls. High ones. But no wall can silence a heartbeat. No doctrine can turn a kiss to ash. The truth is, they tried to bury longing in robes, in rules, in rituals, but longing has roots. It grows in shadow. It wraps around candlelight and winds itself through every hymn. They say God is love. But when love dared to wear skin, when it walked barefoot across monastery floors, when it touched another in the dark, it was branded a lie, a test, a fall, and yet, it kept returning. In dreams, in poems, in the shaking hands of those who dared to disobey just long enough to remember what it meant to feel alive. So, we ask a question, not loud, not demanding, but like breath against glass. Was love the original heresy, or was it the forgotten gospel? The one too wild, too soft, too sacred to ever be canonized. The church bells still ring. But in some quiet corner of the soul, a different sound lingers. A gasp. A moan. A name. Spoken not in sin, but in surrender, and maybe, just maybe, that too, was holy. There is a legend whispered beneath cathedral stones that once, a man wept into a silver bowl until the tears turned gold. They say he wasn't a wizard. He was in love. Alchemy is often remembered as science clothed in shadow, men grinding herbs under moonlight, searching for the philosopher's stone, dreaming of metals that could bleed into light. But not all gold was in the ground. Some believed it lived in the body, in the heart, in the ache between two souls who could never speak their names aloud. In the Middle Ages, love was not a gift. It was a condition, a fever, a haunting. Physicians treated it like a wound. Mystics treated it like a test. And poets, they treated it like fire caught in glass. Courtly love was not sweet. It was sacred suffering. To desire someone you could not touch, to serve them in silence, to ache and ache and ache, was to become purified. They called it noble. But it felt like drowning slowly in perfume. Lovers did not send letters. They sent invocations. A lock of hair, tied with red thread. A whisper placed into a rose, left to die on the altar. A prayer scrawled in the margins of a psalm, half God, half confession. A glance was a contract. A sigh was a signature. A kiss that could unmake a world. There were books, forbidden ones, that spoke of love as alchemy. Not gold from lead, but salvation from longing. They said if your desire was pure, you would suffer. And if you suffered deeply enough, the soul would glow white, like metal under flame. Pain, then, wasn't punishment. It was purification. The burning was holy. A woman would wait 10 winters to hold a man's hand. A knight would bleed on a battlefield just to earn her name in a song, and the more impossible the love, the more divine it became, because in that agony, they believed, the heart became a crucible, a sacred vessel where the raw, black iron of lust could be turned to gold, not erased, transformed. But not all love was so lofty. There were those who mixed herbs into wine to summon dreams of their beloved, who ground rose petals with blood and painted names on their skin. To modern eyes, it may seem madness, but to them, this was medicine. This was magic. This was the only way to survive a world where desire had no name except sin. Some said too much love could kill, that it curdled the blood, dried the marrow, called spirits into the lungs, but others believed it could heal. That one kiss, given in truth, could ease a year's worth of suffering. That love, when freely given, was the purest tincture of all, not of the flesh, but of the soul. And so we find ourselves in a world not so unlike our own, where longing is confused with weakness, and suffering is mistaken for strength. But somewhere between those two shadows, there was something else. A quiet transformation. A turning, not of lead to gold, but of pain into presence, that of absence into light, that of the ordinary heart into something alchemical. So we ask, not to answer, but to remember, what if the fire that breaks you is the same fire that makes you holy? What if every ache was a ritual, and every heartbreak was a step toward the divine? What if love, in all its madness, was never meant to be cured, but consecrated? For they say the unicorn can only be tamed by a virgin's touch, that it lies its horned head in her lap, and weeps a strange tale, soft, gentle, sacred. Yet beneath it, something stirs. A creature of instinct, brought to its knees by innocence. But what is innocence, if not a story told by fear? In the flickering dark of medieval belief, purity was a flame, holy, trembling, and always watched. The untouched woman became an altar, her silence a song, her body a sealed gate, not hers, but theirs. The church. The kingdom. The men who wrote prayers into law. Be a virgin was to be holy. To be anything else was to become a question. A desire was not denied, it was demonized. Wrapped in Latin, bound in myth, and in the shadow of saints, the beast was always waiting. There were frescoes, painted not with reverence, but with warning. A pale maiden kneeling in prayer. A horned creature watching from the woods. Eyes like fire, breath like smoke. In those images, love was not celebration. It was caution. A battlefield between heaven and hunger. And so, the Virgin became more symbol than soul. She was crowned with lilies. She was locked in towers. She was made mother of God, but never mistress of herself. Her body was a prophecy. A garden others swore to guard, but gardens grow wild when left too long. And even in sanctity, there are seeds of sorrow. For every saint who bled for chastity, there was a girl who cried behind stone. For every miracle carved in stained glass, there was a myth of warning etched into the skin of memory. The succubus, the witch, the beast in a bridal gown. Pleasure, they whispered, was the devil's breath, a fire that must never be inhaled, and yet, they wrote of it. In margins, in dreams, in bestiaries that spoke of creatures half man, half urge. They imagined women devoured by desire, men lost in lustful fog, and always a price, because to feel was to fall. The torture chamber, the convent cell, the wedding bed, they blurred. The sacred and the carnal were never truly separate, only disguised, only translated into stories that taught obedience through fear. But was that love? Or control? A girl was told, keep your virtue, bury your fire, pray your beauty is noticed, but not touched, and if you are chosen, be grateful. Even if the choosing feels like breaking. In those candlelit halls of belief, love wore many masks. It wept in veils. It hid in scriptures. It howled in silence, because to truly desire was to risk exile, not from others, but from oneself. So now, centuries later, as we walk the ruins of these myths, we ask gently, what did the Middle Ages see when it looked at love? A miracle waiting to be worshipped, or a mirror that revealed too much? And deeper still, what do we see when we look at love now? Do we still whisper of purity when what we crave is truth? Do we still fear the beast when it lives in us all? Or are we ready, at last, to let the unicorn rest, not in a virgin's lap, but in a field where no one watches? There is a room in the old stories where no one dares go. Its door is sealed, its windows are blind, and the air inside doesn't move, but it's quiet, but not empty. They say the walls remember what the world forgets. In the Middle Ages, desire was not just hidden, it was confined. Pressed into rings. Pinned behind veils. Buried under vows. A woman was a name on parchment, a hand in a dowry, a womb promised to lineage. She was kept. Sometimes for safety. Often for silence, behind stone walls, in gardens enclosed by scripture and shame. She lived like a ghost who had once been flesh. Marriage was not love. It was strategy. It was politics. It was prison dressed in lace. A locked room, not always literal, but always real. She was told, obey. Endure. Be still, and when stillness bred sorrow, they called it virtue, but the soul does not sleep just because the body is trapped. It dreams. It waits. It finds strange ways to speak. Some women wrote. Their ink was bloodless, but burning letters folded into sleeves. Poems tucked inside psalms. A single thread of red stitched into a tapestry of blue. A glance. A metaphor. A silence too sharp to ignored. In these small rebellions, longing became a language, not shouted. Whispered. Like a prayer said backward, because when you cannot scream, you unravel in symbols, and the locked room becomes a cathedral of secrets. One girl embroidered a saint's robe with lilies that never grew in her country. Another pressed herbs into her mattress, to dream of a man she was forbidden to name. A noblewoman in France wrote love letters to a shadow, never signed, never sent, but read every night before she blew out the candle. Some ran, slipped through servants' doors, or vanished into forests wearing nothing but hope and hunger. Others stayed. But inside, they built a world. The world could not touch. A desire became memory. Memory became resistance. A look held too long. A hymn sung too softly. A breath taken when none were watching. In these rooms, love wasn't loud. It was liminal. It flickered like candlelight on cold stone. A thing felt, not seen, and longing, when caged, does not dieit folds inward. Becomes ache. Becomes poetry. Becomes madness, or magic. We ask ourselves now, what happens to a heart that is never allowed to speak? What happens to passion when it has no door, no name, no witness? Does it rot, or does it transfigure? The locked room is not just a room. It is a symbol of all the places we've buried feeling. Of all the times we've mistaken silence for peace, and in that silence, somehow, something survived. A single line of verse. A pressed flower. A dream, soft. Sacred. Unyielding. So now, as the wind moves through ruins, as voices long quiet rise again, we listen, not for the scream, but for the sigh, not for the history, but for the hum beneath it, and we wonder, were the walls built to protect them, or to protect the world from what they truly felt? Because even a locked room has a key, and sometimes, that key is longing itself. They moved like shadows through the world, not to escape it, but to touch something beyond it. They were not saints. Not sinners either. Just seekers, seekers of a love that didn't kneel, but burned. There is a legend told in the hushed corners of forgotten chapels of pilgrims who walked not to holy relics, but toward each other, not by day, but under stars. Not with sandals, but with silence. They called it devotion. Others called it heresy, but it was neither. It was a prayer made with breath. A sacrament made with skin. Not all love in the Middle Ages was caged. Some of it sang low and trembling. A melody carried not through cathedrals, but through caves, forests, and back rooms of inns. There were those who believed desire was not the enemy of God, but the language of him the troubadours knew. Their songs were spells, not for courts or kings, but for lovers who believed the heart was an altar. They wandered from village to village, singing of longing not as weakness, but as worship. Love, for them, was not conquest. It was surrender. To ache was to awaken, and in certain hidden sects, they took this belief further. In candlelit rooms perfumed with myrrh and sandalwood, they practiced rites so intimate, so sacred, they blurred the boundary between touch and transcendence. Tantric orders whispered that the divine was not far and cold, but near, trembling beneath the surface of skin. The body, they said, was not a cage, but a temple waiting to be entered with reverence. Even in cloisters and monasteries, not everyone feared the pulse of blood. Some monks wrote of Christ not as king, but as lover. They dreamed of being consumed by divine affection, not in metaphor, but in visceral, overwhelming union. Saint Teresa spoke of an angel piercing her heart with God's golden arrow. She called it bliss, but others read it as something else, something older, deeper, and more forbidden. These were the night pilgrims, the sacred dissenters, the soft revolutionaries of spirit and flesh. They wandered not for rebellion, but for rapture. They believed in a God not made of fear, but of fire. And in their quiet corners of Europe, in southern France, in Andalusian gardens, in hilltop abbeys and midnight gatherings, they remembered something the world tried to forget, that to be alive, truly, is to feel. To tremble, to desire, to love so deeply you vanish into it. They did not ask the church for permission. They did not ask history to remember them, but they left echoes, in worn manuscripts, in stone carvings of lovers intertwined, in the shape of old songs, still sung in tongues no one understands. They left us a question folded gently into time. What if the soul's deepest longing was not for heaven, but for union, not to ascend, but to dissolve, not to escape the body, but to become it fully? Holy, hungry, hold it. So now, we walk where they once did, not on maps, but inward. A pilgrimage of feeling, of sacred yearning, and we ask, was the forbidden love they followed a sin, or was it the oldest form of prayer? Perhaps love was never the veil over God, but the door, and the night, soft, silver, full of shadows and scent, was the only place quiet enough to hear him whisper back. There is an old story, never written, only remembered, of a woman who wandered the woods in her wedding veil. She was not lost. She was listening. They say she spoke to the trees, as if they were confessors, and laid her hands on stones, as if they were lovers. Her vow was not to a man, nor to a church, but to something deeper, something that has no name and asks only one thing: surrendered. At the end of all longing, there is a door. Not grand, not golden, just a small, quiet threshold at the edge of the soul. Some reach it through prayer, others through pain. Most arrive by accident, in the arms of someone they cannot name, in the echo of a song they don't remember learning. And when they arrive, the question always finds them: to whom do I belong? In the Middle Ages, they tried to answer it with chains. The soul was fenced by scripture, the body was walled by law. Love became a contract, a cage, a commandment whispered through incense and iron. Vows were traded like land. Desire was punished like crime, and every touch had to be measured against heaven. But the heart, the wild, trembling heart, does not kneel for long. It slipped between the cracks, in secret glances across candlelit pews, in letters stitched into hems, in midnight hands, reaching for warmth beneath the weight of dogma. Even in the most austere abbey, even in the most brutal court, there were whispers that love, true love, is not an act of possession, but of surrender. They feared it, not because it was sinful, but because it was sacred. To be truly seen, to be undone by someone's gaze, was more terrifying than any sin, because it meant giving up control, narrative, self, and becoming something else. Something shared. Something. Broken open in the margins of ancient books, you'll find drawings of lovers wrapped around each other like roots. Saints with mouths slightly parted. Eyes closed, not in ecstasy, but in trust that you'll find prayers that sound like poems. Poems that sound like pleas. And between the lines, always this aching, let me be known. Let me be touched by something that will not harm me. Let me fall and be held. It wasn't domination they were after, these old mystics and lovers. It was release from the burden of being alone in one's skin. Release from the walls built around longing. They knelt. Not in submission, but in offering. Not I am yours, but I am willing. Willing to be changed. Willing to be seen. Willing to disappear into something greater than the self. In hidden rituals, in rites that blurred the line between passion and prayer, they gave themselves not to power, but to mystery. A mystery that asked nothing but everything to lie bare before love's altar and say, take what you need. Take what I cannot carry. Take what was never mine to hold. And so the story circles back to chapels lit by trembling hands, to cloisters echoing with forbidden songs, to those veiled women in the woods, and the men who followed them, not to claim, but to join, not domination, not escape, but surrender, because in the end, what is love if not the sacred art of saying yes, yes, to being known? Yes, to being changed. Yes, to the unmaking that is also a becoming. Somewhere, perhaps, a vow still lingers, not written in ink, but in breath, not spoken aloud, but felt in the space between two trembling hands. A vow not to possess, but to disappear into another, into the divine, into the unspeakable beauty of being known and not turned away. So now, as we stand at the final threshold, where desire meets divinity, where history dissolves into myth, we ask not what was true. We ask, what have you been resisting, that was only ever asking to be surrendered to? There is a sound that only silence makes, a hush so deep it feels like breath held in stone, as if the walls themselves remember something they can no longer speak aloud. The echo of a sigh, not yours, not quite human, but ancient, tender, waiting. The torches have long gone out. The chants are dust. The parchment is cracked, its words now only ghosts pressed in fiber, but still, something lingers, not knowledge, not fact, but feeling, like waking from a dream that was not yours to dream. There was a time, not so long ago, when love was a vow, a sacrifice, a slow-burning fire beneath velvet and iron. It was a wound and a wonder, a cathedral built inside the ribs that we wandered its chambers blindfolded, believing that pain was the proof that longing meant holiness, that to ache was to be real. Now those cathedrals are hollow, their stained glass shattered by centuries. But if you listen, really listen, you'll hear them still singing, not with words, with memory, with ache, the ache that drips from bloodlines, that hums in our quietest hours, that waits beneath the skin like a question we've forgotten how to ask. We walk through the modern world as though unbound, freed from vows, from locks, from scripts, and yet, we ache differently, but no less deeply. As if something sacred was abandoned too soon, as if freedom was too quiet without the weight of meaning. What if we did not escape a prison, but walked out of a ritual before it finished? What if the things they feared, the fire of longing, the surrender of self, the trembling holiness of touch, were never dangers at all, but doorways we closed too early, too completely, leaving behind not chains, but keys. In the dream space of history, we find not clarity, but shadows shaped like us. A nun kissing a page as if it were flesh, a knight whispering prayers to a silk ribbon tied at his wrist, a woman writing her ache into the margins of her cookbook, just to be heard by someone someday. They were not so different, They loved. They feared. They wanted to be held by something that would not vanish. So, do we? Perhaps the rituals crumbled. But the ache did not. It changed costumes. It changed names. Now we swipe instead of sing. Now we ask, not for vows, but for proof. For instant recognition. For lightning that does not require weather, and yet, when it doesn't come, we do not rage. We mourn. Silently. Endlessly. Like ghosts in our own skin, there was a time when love had seasons. Winters of waiting. Springs of risk. Summers of touch. And autumns of surrender. Now we rush. We blur. We flatten time, but some part of us, deep in the marrow, inherited from those long-forgotten souls, still wants to kneel. Still wants to be changed. Still longs for the ceremony of being chosen, and choosing us. So we light candles without knowing why. We keep relics of lovers we claim to have forgotten. We write poems in our phones that no one will ever read. That we practice in secret, the rituals we think we don't believe in, because the echo remains in the sigh before sleep. In the glance that lingers too long. In the dream that leaves us weeping at dawn. This is not history. It is inheritance. Not facts, but feeling. Not past, but presence, wearing the mask of memory. And so the story ends, not with a truth, but with a silence. A silence full of hands that once reached. Full of eyes that once searched. Full of voices that once whispered, I am here. Will you meet me? Will you stay? There is no answer. Only echo. Only scent. Only a veil half lifted by longing. And now, you too must ask, was love the chain that bound us, or the spell we forgot how to cast? And more quietly still, when was the last time you meant it when you said, I am yours?